Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. This week's guest is the Vadi master himself, Mr. Connor Kemp-Cowell. Connor is by far one of my favorite fencers in HEMA. His dedication to and utilization of canonical techniques doesn't only look amazing, it's helped him make the finals and scores of tournaments across the US. He's a dedicated scholar that doesn't take himself too seriously, keeps kindness, equity, and courtesy in the forefront of his affront on the HEMA community, where he's helped bring Vadi from the fringes of the collective conscious into the imaginations of practitioners of every discipline. Connor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. And let me say, it's crazy to hear that in person.
Yeah, man. You've honestly, you are one of my favorite fencers to watch. I mean, I think
Oh.
the first time I got a chance to talk to you at an event, it was right after IGX in 2018, and I just walked up to you and I remember just like shaking your hand. I was like, dude, that fight against Arto Pharma was the coolest thing that I have ever seen because it was such a great fight. It was incredible. Um, but one of the reasons why I love your fencing so much is because you don't pull any punches when it comes to fencing from a historical perspective. The way that you fight, transitioning between guards, everything that you do is strictly historical. I rarely, if ever, have seen you do something that's just doing it because it works in a tournament setting. And the fact that you've been so successful with your tournament career in doing that makes you one of my absolute favorite fencers. So it's an honor to have you.
Thank you so fucking much. That the whole reason why I go to tournaments in the first place, other than to meet the fantastic people and get to share what I practice and what I've learned over my scant few years of doing HEMA, is I want to be an exemplar of the fact that if you go to competition and you are willing to compete and you are interested in that facet of this great big science experiment that we have that's called HEMA, is that you can get the stuff in the books to work as long as you put the work into it. And hearing you say that means that part of my goal has been accomplished. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's incredible. So, I mean, you've kind of come from a perspective of studying Vadi, but recently you've started to really kind of look into the Bolognese sources and start, learning the good art, the true art. I'm just kidding.
yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah.
So, before we get into that, tell me about how you got into HEMA. Tell me a little bit about your martial arts background.
Okay, so like I didn't do any real martial arts. I don't have any martial arts background except for HEMA. I found out about HEMA maybe like 7 years ago. Because I'm a big fucking nerd. Am I okay to curse? Can I curse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
No, I'll
Yeah.
I'll throw
No.
in an explicit tag on there, and people can just take that for what they will.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm a giant fucking nerd. And I have been running and playing Dungeons and Dragons for like 9 years, some shit like that, right?
Awesome.
And I wanted to learn how to describe sword combat better in D&D. So I went on YouTube and I was just like medieval fencing, and like one of the first things that popped up was Bratislavski Sierzmarki, or however you pronounce it in Slovakian. Martin Fabian's club, and like him and Anton Kwotovic doing, actually no, it was Anton Kwotovic. Anton Kwotovic's video of them doing like hardcore recreation of the plays from the RDL sources, and I watched it and I was like, I want to do that. I want that to be me.
Yeah.
So like there was like a good 2 year period where I had discovered HEMA and I knew what it was, and I was just using it to help like describe like encounters with different like monsters and bandits and shit. And then one fateful trip down to Dragon Con with my ex at the time, I went to Dragon Con, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, and I encountered um, I think it was the Atlanta Fry Factor. I'm not entirely sure. It's been a few years.
Probably was. Yeah. They do
Yeah,
that almost every year. Yeah.
they were teaching like a basic intro to HEMA class there, and so I was like, "Yo, here's this thing that I've been like just like kind of like looking at for 2 3 years that I could actually have the chance to do it. And so, I went there, I did the thing, and then I got back home to Philadelphia after the con, and I was like, you know what? I wonder if there's a HEMA group nearby. I looked up, like Philadelphia HEMA, and come to find out, there's somebody only 20 minutes away from me. So I went there, and it's been history. It's been like that ever since. I ended up being the head instructor of my club now. And yeah, that's where we're at, my guy.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And uh, so many times, even I think this is even in Marazzo, or at least in Manciolino. It's in one of the Bolognese sources. They talk about how you can basically judge the quality of an instructor. It's probably Manciolino because he likes to talk shit about Marazzo, so we think. And so he says something along the lines of you can judge the quality of an instructor based on their students. And it's not just the fact that you are a fantastic fencer. Your students and the people who have come out of the Philly Common Fencers Guild are all fantastic fencers. And I think that speaks volumes to what you're doing and your ability to convey ideas and things like that. So
Thank you.
yeah.
The other thing is too, the other wrinkle to that story is how I got attached to Vadi, and how I ended up going on this great long experiment into making this shit work. And that comes from a fateful day where like I was obsessed with great swords when I first got into HEMA, and because I'm a massive Dark Souls fan, and I like was asking my instructor, Grant Meyer, like over and over again, it's like, yo, can we get somebody out to do great sword? Can we get somebody out to do great sword? And so he asked James Clark to
Yeah.
come out and teach a class on Montante, or Spadone. And so he did a class on Alfieri, and afterwards I asked him about like the earlier Italian sources, because I initially started off doing Fiore. Fiore was like my main thrust, and our club in its infancy was a common fencing curriculum with a sprinkle of Meyer kind of tossed into the mix. But I was the lone Italian fencer who yeah, I was that guy. I was a lone Italian fencer, and I had something to prove. So I was like, James Reed is do you think Fiore is cool? What do you know about Fiore, James Reed? And James Reed, why am I saying James Reed? James Clark. James Clark, what do you think? Do you think Fiore is cool, James Clark? And James Clark was like, yeah, Fiore is a really interesting and awesome source, but I think that Filippo Vadi has a lot more constructive system to it, and is a lot easier to say. I mean, is a lot easier to like parse and read. And I was like, huh, okay, you know what? I'm gonna give that guy a shot. And one of the things that set me apart early on was just like hitting those books. I love reading the sources. I can never feel like I have time lost if I spend time reading the text. So I got home that day, and I instantly went on Wits and Howard. I looked up Vadi, and I read and I read and I read for days at a time, over and over again, and it clicked. It made so much sense to me. And I asked online. I did a lot of research trying to figure out if there was anything out there for him, and there just was nothing. The closest thing I could find was, looking at the Bolognese stuff, looking at Manciolino, looking at Marazzo, looking at, mostly Manciolino, Marazzo, and a lot of the videos for Sword alone that CSG had done was like the closest kind of like approximation I could find. And so I was like, there's a lot of cool stuff in this book that people aren't doing that needs to change. And then I ended up stumbling upon Jamie McKeever's work. I don't know if you're familiar with Jamie, but he also kind of had a very similar story where he stumbled upon Vadi, or was asked to research a source that was uncommon. And so he also had a similar story of finding Vadi, and was like, yo, this shit's cool. Nobody's doing it. Why don't I put out stuff for it? And so like he was my guiding light in the darkness of the internet.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And so now that you've now we can get back to kind of transitioning into the Bolognese sources, because
Yes.
you've come back to the Bolognese. So now that you have kind of gone through, started out with the Bolognese and then transitioned into looking at Vadi and then coming back to Marazzo, um, how do you see that in like context and comparison? Like how does that lay out for you?
So, good question. When I first started off looking at the Bolognese sources, the transitional period between like the earlier medieval texts like Fiore and Vadi into like the hardcore, like everything is laid out as clearly as it possibly can be, um, stuff in the Bolognese. I'm glad I waited to have an understanding of how Fiore and Vadi worked before I touched upon the Bolognese stuff, because one of the things about Bolognese that I found personally, was that there is so much information that's just kind of like put on you from the get, um, that it was very difficult for me to interface with. But coming back to it now, after I've put in my dues and I've spent my time with Vadi in particular. It reads crystal clear. It's no problem for me. I think the biggest difference, and I really would say this for most masters, if you're going to be doing a comparison and contrasting type deal, is tactics. Like 9 times out of 10, everybody likes to say that there's no new thing under the sun, and that it really comes down to the preference of the master that you're reading, and um, how they apply technique into a situation. Um, like Marazzo in particular with his two-handed sword, if we're comparing and contrasting him to Vadi, has a lot more, has a lot different idea of how to constrain an opponent, in my opinion, as opposed to Vadi. I think that, um, it doesn't help that Marazzo's writing is kind of all over the fucking place.
Yep.
But he had a lot to say, and I love him for that. Um, but specifically when it comes to the material of the two-handed sword in Marazzo, it all kind of follows that same general Italian way of seeing what guard your opponent is in, like aligning yourself to that, assessing how you're going to kind of get their sword either on the line or off the line, um, and through the process of that constraining, hitting them, and then covering yourself on the way out. And the way I would see Marazzo do that would be through like some type of complex feint, like a threat that changes like on a high line or a low line that then comes into something else. You hit, and then you do your beautiful falso dritto, and then you're fucking out. You did your thing. Vadi, on the other hand, is just all about that stretta play, mezzospada play, where he's tight. He wants you to fight in the pocket and very close to the opponent. So, but they still follow that same general guideline of alignment, assessment, constrain, hit, cover, and the same thing happens for the rapier masters too. If we're looking later on. So that expression of how you're supposed to enter an exchange and exit it safely is baseline, but the way that the masters want you to do that tactically is different.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I mean I agree with you. And it could be because Marazzo, I find two specific things that make Marazzo a little bit different for me in terms of the earlier sources, and one is the technological advancement of having lugs on your longsword.
Mhm.
Like, I, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to fight with a longsword that has lugs on it.
Oh, yes, I have.
Yeah, it changes the game, right?
It does. It
Like,
does. Yeah.
yeah, when somebody's in a high guard and they're cutting, just a fendente at the top of your head and you go into guardia di faccia, if you do that with just a hilted or a shilted longsword, they're going to smack you in the top of the head. You're not going to stop that, right?
Yep.
But if you have lugs, you're going to stop that because you have basically the parry point of your sword is, almost like 8 or 9 inches out.
It's
So
further up. Yeah.
yeah, and it makes a huge difference. So that's one thing, and that it changes bind dynamics too. And the other thing is obviously the length of the weapon, I think, makes a difference as well,
Hmm.
because you have more emphasis on wide play, I think, when you have a longer weapon, just because, just like if you were fighting somebody who, you're just recently you posted a great video of your fights from Sword and Buckler at the recent Steel City tournament, right? And you were fighting with a side sword. Some of your opponents were fighting with arming swords, and when you were fighting with an opponent with an arming sword, you're going to approach that fight a lot different, right? You're going to basically use the fact that you have that length advantage, and even when you're fighting somebody else with a side sword, the fight tends to be a little bit different. Like you look at the difference between a source like Manciolino or Marazzo and compare that to I-33. Of course, I-33 is like super bind dependent because you're
Yep.
using a 28, inch arming sword, and that's what the techniques really want. So,
Yeah. The other thing on top of that too, if we're to bring it from single-handed sword to two-handed sword, and to Vadi in particular, and to look at like old school like early Italian stuff versus like Bolognese, there's a reason I find that Fiore and Vadi kind of put an emphasis on you being in the bind, and part of that is because you don't have that. Um, mm, mm, there's always the margin of error when you are in a fight to get doubled or to get hit, right? That's something that we always have to worry about because you're in a fucking sword fight. It's not a it's not fun, and it's unless you're doing school fencing, right? And
yeah.
both y'all are in this for looking pretty and artful and showing off that sprezzatura. And Fiore always starts off his stuff with talking about the bind, right? You got the first master and the second master of the point crossing in the Mezzospada, and everything kind of delineates off there. Whereas Vadi just focuses strictly on the Mezzospada play. And I know that the Bolognese sources do that as well, right? They talk about Largo and Stretta, and then Mezzospada play on top of that. But to me, it seems like the way I like to think about it is that, okay, sword length, that's where we were at. Okay, that's it. Okay, so when we're talking about the difference in sizes of swords for the Bolognese two-handed stuff versus the earlier Italian stuff, right? And how like parrying lugs and the length of a two-handed sword changes the dynamics of a fight. Vadi's sword isn't, I would say, too different from kind of what Marazzo and the Anonimo talk about in terms of their sword length, but still he has this foot in two worlds vibe to him, right? Where he still has these vestigial features of Fiore, like the exchange of points and the breaking of the thrust, that are still like very clearly in there and very clearly like openers to the rest of what he considers to be artful. And those same features kind of still stick around in the Bolognese stuff as well. But there is a clear delineation over the period of time where now it's a lot more focused in the Bolognese sources on constraint through feinting and constraint through doing more complex blade actions or feints where the blades are only touching for a very brief period of time before you take another line and then hit, right? And the same thing appears in Vadi as well, but the Bolognese tradition as a whole has this great emphasis on beats that are just like so beautiful and so fancy. Yeah. And I love to see it when it does show up in fencing. But the difference, I would say, comes in the fact that, as I said with Vadi, he still has that focus on you immediately going back into the bind. Whereas they're kind of the Bolognese sources are kind of okay with you threatening something, staying on one line, and then taking another one. Except in the Anonimo plays, where he has, in my opinion, seemingly a bit more stuff that's a bit more bind heavy as opposed to Marazzo.
He does, yeah. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I think I don't know. I know there's a great discussion going on Discord right now just about the age of the Anonimo, but I almost feel like, in my opinion, the Anonimo is early or is later but some people argue that it is earlier because of the beating actions that are in there. Um, but I've always gotten the sense that, I mean, I'm kind of two minds in that regard, but I mean, the way when you spell it out like that, it almost makes it seem like it sounds a little bit earlier. Like you said, there's that emphasis on bind actions and keeping that close. Um, but one of the things that I also feel is sort of paramount to the tactical approach that I love about Fiore and about Vadi in particular, and I think you do see it in the Bolognese sources at times, is that it's all about controlling your opponent's weapon. You know,
Yep.
like and HEMA tournaments in general, we always complain about doubles and things like that, and
Mhm.
so much of that is a failure of people who are basically going to attack, not recognizing that they also have to cover the line of their opponent's sword, and
Mhm.
just going to an open target rather than closing off the potential line of attack that's going to come back through. And I think it's spelled out in the sources that way. Um, and I think that's why you're such a great tournament fighter as well, is because you're basically, I think you've pulled that out of the sources in the way that you fight. Um, and I've seen that too, you know, with all of your students. You guys have a tendency to, you know, cut to close angles. You're equally attacking your opponent's sword in a way that prevents it from coming back at you, and attacking an open target at the same time. Um, and I think that's really the way that we should be emphasizing and looking at these things, because you know, basically just hitting for the idea of hitting without recognizing the threat of your opponent's weapon is just a really bad idea.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like across all of the sources in the Bolognese tradition, right? If we look at Dialogocchie, if we look at Manciolino, if we look at Marazzo, there is always this idea of an initiation where you are putting the pressure onto the opponent. You're making them decide, okay, do I want to get hit in the hands? Do I want to get hit in the face? Um, and the answer is resoundingly no.
Yeah, yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
yeah. And from there you have your aha moment. You are in the present time where you are threatening them so that they must move their sword into a position that is advantageous for you and disadvantageous for them, right? There's always this idea of stealing tempo and constraining them, from which you can do other things, or through provocation, whether that be through gathering measure by going into a shortened stance or what have you, right? And then from there you play. And in tournament play in particular, I think Greg Merlet, when you had him on, did a great job of talking about that high stress environment that is present in tournaments, right? And it's very difficult to stay in the moment when you have all of that pressure on you, right? um but staying open eyes, I think is a great term for this. Keeping your eyes open to the situation is all that the sources talk about. Not even just Bolognese, not even just um, the early Italian sources, but also the RDL, like the early Lichtenhauer sources, and Meyer as well. It's a general theme of just like, stay in the moment, stupid. Make sure you don't get hit. Don't close your eyes and just do whatever you want to do. Um, or whatever your body tells you to do, right? Those there's a time and a place for that, of course.
Yeah,
Closed eyes actions where you instantly see a target, you go for it, or you have this combo in mind where you threaten one part and then immediately move into the next one, is also present in all of the sources as well. But the overall emphasis is on staying with your opponent's action through the entirety of it as it goes down, so that you can be in control of the situation and the opponent's blade, so that you can hit without getting
yeah,
hit.
yeah, no, for sure. And you know, I think that's where like the emphasis on beats comes in, and because they do help you to control lines and create openings. You're basically creating a tempo by attacking your opponent's sword. And I know, you know, our school is split between like KDF and the Bolognese essentially, and we have this, you know, on the KDF side, they really emphasize not attacking your opponent's sword. That's one of the first things they teach their students.
Mhm.
And it's funny because we teach the exact opposite. um, you know, but it is within a framework of context, right? Like it's
Yep.
basically, you know, there's situations when you almost are forced to beat your opponent's sword. Um, and you know, you still see that with Fiore, and in some ways he still has some actions where you're just kind of taking your opponent's sword out of presence with beating actions or strong cuts to your opponent's sword. And I think so much of that emphasis, um, just I think it translates all the way through the Italian sources. Um, how do you view that in terms of like just that framework and that tactical approach kind of stemming through what you've seen since you've studied really from, you know, the beginning of what we have as Italian sources with Fiore and Vadi and Imrazzo.
So I'm lucky enough that the area that I am in, like the Philadelphia area, has like so many great practitioners, just like a stone's throw away from each other. I get the chance to work with Stephen Chaney up to the north, and all of his wonderful folks at Buck's Historical Longsword, and Steve has been doing this awesome work on making first intention attacks just like work, just through means of footwork, right? Um, and it's changed my perception on how us as practitioners should view first intention actions, right? And how delivering like a descending cut that hits as soon as you throw it is supposed to go down, and thus has changed my perception on how a lot of the binding actions in the Italian tradition work. Not just that, but also how we approach a fight in modern longsword and whatever what modern HEMA today. Um, for example, Fiore, right? The crossings of the first two masters, right? In my opinion, when folks approach a fight, right, there always has to be some type of reconnaissance that's done on the opponent to figure out what the fuck they're trying to do, right? You don't
Yep.
want to just like walk up to them and be like, okay, I throw my cut without that splits, without some kind of information being received from you and deciding on where to go from there. And uh, bringing that to beating and attacking to the sword first, as opposed to attacking directly to the body. There's this awareness inside of the sources that first intentions don't generally work, or that um, how would I say it? Not just that first intention actions don't work, but that they are merely part of the game to make it safe for you to hit, right? And when we're talking about things like a perfect example of this would be like Fiore's Second Master, where you cross in the mids, you do some type of action to clear their sword out of the way, whether that be through a strong beat or whatever your interpretation is, to hit behind their sword to their hand and then drive the point forward, right? You can clearly read that as like some type of strong beat or clearing action from which you then follow through with that attack. In Marazzo, when you throw that falso impuntanto to get the opponent's sword offline, and then you do your two mandrito afterwards, right? Those kinds of those two mandrito, one of them probably being a beat to their sword to then clear for you to then hit. In Vadi, when you're talking about threatening with a thrust from below, and then cutting to the opposite side as soon as your opponent responds to your thrust to stop their sword and then hit them afterwards. All of these actions, right? These clearing actions that are present in the Italian tradition, as it ripples through time, represent, in my opinion, a an idea of probing the opponent to force their response, right? So you don't have to worry about that first intention. You're giving them the stimulus and the threat that they have to respond to the sword. So you don't have to play from the guards, fencing in Largo with the two-handed sword, which is dangerous as shit.
Super dangerous. Yeah.
Super, super dangerous. You're putting the onus on them to have to respond to something, and then you are clear to hit the sword afterwards because you have them. You have them right where you want them.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing that comes to mind with that in particular, right, is that sometimes when you're fencing against an opponent where their sword is already in presence, right? If we're talking about somebody just like being in an extended point forward guard, whether it be like postalunga or spreck fencer or whatever the fuck you want to call it, right? I'm putting my point in your face, and you have to do something about it,
Right.
right? That is an incredible stimulus that's an incredible stimulus for you to do the exact same thing, right? Whenever you see somebody in a tournament or free fencing or what have you, walk forwards towards the opponent and just like shove the point in their face, right? Just threaten them. That's in every single text that we have, right? That's a generally good action, and all of the masters agree on it. Walk
Yeah.
forward, shove the point in their face, and see what they do. But that's also a great thing for us on the receiving end, because, oh great, you're giving me your blade, I get to do something else in response to that. And I think another paradigm that is present in modern HEMA is that when we have those types of situations happen to us, where we have the point just like thrusted into our face, or the opponent just walking forward in a point forward guard, that we don't want to give them the sword, right? We don't want to give them our sword in response, or we want to fence from a high cutting guard thing out here. We should also be okay with putting our stuff out there as well, so that we can do things like take their blade with some type of like beating action, or like some type of binding action that clears their sword out of the way and then hitting afterwards. So yeah, that's those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean that's great, right? And that's basically, the way that I see that first play from Larga, from Marazzo, with that the Fallaciari of the Falso Impuntanto, is your opponent is giving you that point forward guard there in Porta de Ferro Larga. So,
Mhm.
they're just out there with their point in front of your face, and you have to deal with it. So, he basically tells you to feint, and they chase, and that's what sets up the Falso Impuntanto. So, um, that whole idea, or well, I mean, the falso impuntanto sets up the follow-up action. But
Yep.
um, it's interesting because I know that you've talked to Kurt Holfreder quite a bit, and
Yeah.
we've got a wing of TSG right now, which is the club that I'm at, Triangle Sword Guild, but we are or have a wing that's really like diving deep into Fiore. And I've been taking part in this because I'm excited to basically draw the connections that you've drawn. Now,
Yes.
I mean, my primary weapon focus through my HEMA career has always been the side sword. So like I'm like probably like a C fencer with a longsword, and probably like an A fencer with a side sword. Like you put a side sword in my hand, and I will medal in any tournament that I fight in. But you put a longsword in my hand, and I'm like, I'm right. But I'm trying to change that, but I want to change it in a way that basically the way that you did it, right? Like go back to Fiore, go back to Vadi, and then come back to Marazzo and see how Marazzo is informed by those things and really kind of builds on this whole sort of, uh, you know, pedagogical advancement, as it will. But with one of the things that Kurt's really been working on, and the way that he kind of teaches that is really interesting because it harkens on a theme that I've seen in lots of different sword fighting systems. So the way that he teaches the Gioco Largo plays with Fiore is basically you cut from anywhere you want. He believes that Fiore's just like, I don't care where your sword is at, just go to the middle, right? And cut to your opponent's sword, or meet them in a central bind. If they have a weak bind, then you go ahead and you thrust through because you have leverage. If they give you a strong bind, then you cut around and you cut to the other side, right? And the plays basically progress from there. And even as you come into like a deeper crossing on the sword, that's when you'll go for example, from grabbing your opponent's sword, turning it up to grabbing their sword and thrusting, or working around and kind of working into abrazare and wrestling and things like
Yep.
that.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing, you bring up Spreckfenster, and I see Spreckfenster almost being the exact same way. And this actually came to me when I was studying I-33. And the way that I read I-33, and this could be complete BS. I'm sure there are I-33 people out there who are just going to be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But for me personally, when I read I-33, the way that I read it is, when your opponent comes into half shield, I don't think that your opponent is approaching you at half shield, right? I think that basically what they're doing is they're cutting to the center to find a bind, just like we would with other systems and other ways to approach the fight. And I think that what your response is that's you also cutting to the center. And basically from there, you're going to what is the concept of Spreckfenster that we see in KDF, where you're essentially cutting to that central bind and then progressing through the fight from there, right?
Yep.
And if instead of just like, you're going to wait for your opponent to come at you like this, and then you're just going to cut over their sword. It doesn't quite work like that, but you start from wide guards, you try to basically come in and dominate the center, and then you progress through the fight from there based on how your opponent pushes your pressure. It's almost exactly like chess, right?
Yes,
Like
completely. Yes.
the initial like goal of chess is to push your pawns in the middle, to support your pawns in the middle, and then as your opponent reacts to that, you start to work around the flanks. And it's basically the exact same concept played out just with sword fighting.
I can't agree with you more, especially when it comes to Fiore's first master and second master. The same way that you described coming into Habshill in I-33, where you're threatening that center line or your opponent is coming onto you in that center line, is the exact same way that I see the first master of Fiore play out. Exactly. The guards in Fiore represent the tactical understanding of what you're supposed to be doing, fencing in Largo if you want to stay in Largo, and then the different ways that you can move to playing in the Masters of Battle, in my opinion, right? That's the perspective that I see. Whereas when you have an opponent that's threatening the center line, or you probe your opponent to figure out that information, and if they cross you at the tips, or if they cross you at the middle, or if you throw a first intention cut, um, and you end up at that Mezzospada binds in Fiore in particular, I think that the first master is strictly something that happens in Largo play when you cross at the points, and that's informed from my understanding of Vadi, where in part of the text he says, if your opponent crosses you wide and you thrust, you don't want to be divided from him. I believe that that's a crossing at the points from which you enter in after they've crossed you, what have you, right? And that same kind of chess move ideology, or thought process is how I look at a lot of like Largo play. Where if you've bound your opponent, right, you're basically saying, hey, check, what are you going to do? And if you if they cut around, or if you cut around, you're the person that's been checked, right? You're giving up your initial line that you have taken, and then I have time to do whatever else my system tells me to do afterwards. We are of the exact same mind on
Yeah,
that.
no, that's awesome, because I think this translates well into Marazzo, and I think sometimes, especially with the two-handed sword, there's a little too much emphasis because it's the easiest to sort of progress through from like the first set of Marazzo's plays, which are all Larga plays, right? But even Marazzo's intention from Larga oftentimes is to move his opponent in some way out of a point forward guard. They're sitting there and they've got their point at you,
Yep.
and he's
Mm-hmm.
giving you a lot of different ways to deal with this thing so that way you can come in. And of course he's attacking from Larga and then retreating. But I mean, even it's not too dissimilar to the way that he, with the single-handed sword, the way that he approaches dealing with thrust. He gives you lots of different ways to deal with this specific thrust, and all of them are really kind of, there's this almost ambiguity of why would you have to do 6 different ways of, or I mean, I think it's five different ways of defending against a thrust with a single-handed sword. But when you look at it in its context and you think about the fact that measure is going to be different, right? So perhaps measure is informing these things. These are things that are not stated, right?
Yep.
Because I think these are things that Marazzo would have assumed that Sebastian would have understood as an author. But when when you look at the plays, the different responses really are predicated, I believe, on the different things that your opponent gives you, whether or not they are strong in the bind, whether or not they are weak in the bind with that thrust, whether or not, they're thrusting from a really close measure, whether or not they're thrusting from a really far measure. Like, when does that leg cut make sense that Marazzo does with a single-handed sword? Probably when your opponent is thrusting from out of measure and trying to take a step in to come in,
Yep.
then you their sword and you cut their leg, right?
Yep.
They've given you a tempo, you take that tempo of the step, you remove their sword and you cut them to the leg.
Completely. Yeah, no, like right there with you. And the other thing I think, specifically when we're talking about, how would I say it? When we're talking about the differences in measure, timing, and control of the weapon, single-handed sword versus two-handed sword in particular, right? The footwork and the method of you controlling the blade, in single-handed sword, I think you have a lot more margin for error, generally speaking, with a single-handed weapon as opposed to a second-handed weapon. I believe that there is a very real reason as to why most of the time when we talk about using a two-handed sword, Largo play is just non-existent, right? Like, we have it in Marazzo, right? But if we are to look back and look at Fiore and look at Vadi, speaking in the Italian tradition, they're both like Mezzospada boys. That's where that's where they want to be. Whereas like the artful movement and way of fencing conservatively from out of measure, or just at like that wide measure, that real Largo play that we find in single-handed sword, whether that be with a companion weapon or a companion or not, is there with the weapon. And there's always something that is missing from every single author that you read, whether that be footwork, whether that be the specifics of how you're supposed to bring the arms up, whether that be this, that, or the other. And it's a damn shame. It's a damn shame.
The
But
most complete source is Meyer, which frustrates everybody, I think.
God bless him though. God bless him. Fucking
Yeah.
Oh my God. That poor guy dying in the fucking rain.
I know, right? What a way to go.
What a shame.
So I think I distracted you from your point, and I'm sorry about that. But
it's all good.
I agree wholeheartedly. And something you said actually kind of made me think about Marazzo in particular. Like, when you get into book 2 of, or chapter 2 of book 3 of Marazzo, and you start looking at his two-handed sword plays, and he's starting to progress into the stretta techniques. One of the things that I find is really interesting, and this is something that I've seen a lot in your fencing, which I think is fantastic. Even before you admitted that you had started into the Bolognese system, it was something I was like, hey, wait a second, that looks just like something that I've read. And basically, Marazzo will do this thing where he loves to embellish in book 2. And basically, the reason why he's embellishing is because he's trying to provoke the opponent to attack you, right? You're basically like kind of giving your opponent from outside of measure. You're giving your opponent the temptation to come in and just give you an attack, so you can make a parry, and then you can progress into stretta plays. And I've seen you do this a lot with Vadi and the way that you fence. You will embellish the crap out of your opponents in order to get them to just like, hey man, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna get you at this point. Or they're maybe perhaps, if they are aware, they're looking for tempos where they could come in on you in the process of your embellishment. And sometimes that works. Like, referencing your Arto Pharma fight earlier, I went back and I watched that today because I knew I was going to talk to you about it. But you actually caught him in the process of basically coming in and embellishing on you. like I think it was your first exchange where he was basically going and coming up over and then tried to come back over on the other side, and you came straight over top his sword and caught him in the tempo of him basically embellishing to try to provoke an attack. And you caught him mid-tempo and contra-tempo, and I was just like, oh, that was so good. But I think that's what Morazzo is doing. Like, I think he's embellishing to provoke that attack out of his opponent. So how do you see that playing out in your tactical approach to fighting?
Okay, so right, like I said at the beginning, one of the reasons why I go to tournaments is I want to do the thing correct to the book, and I want to look fucking pretty while I do it, right? I wanna go there, and I want to know that I want to confirm that the things that I have been studying are not bullshit, right? That's one of the reasons why I go there, and part of that, in my opinion, is bringing that bolo steez, at least in some part, or that Vadi steez into where we do it. The Italians would call that sprezzatura, but um, but the other thing about that, and particularly like flourishing and embellishing to provoke a tempo, or to see how your opponent responds to you doing these cuts and these feinted thrusts and all of the stuff that comes with that, is to see if you're going to force them into a position where they are attacking into a line that you are very clearly aware is there, so that you can then counter it and then respond with something, right? There's nothing I love more when I am in the middle of doing like some fancy flourish and I end up in a position like Posta Vera Finestra or Posta Sagittaria, and I get that center line thrust, and an opponent is like just like waiting there, like they see it very clearly, and I'm like, thank you, and I and I do something in response to that, and the tactical thought process, putting aside looking fancy and all that bullshit, is I am not only presenting a very clear and obvious threat by moving through different positions and doing multiple cuts in Largo, but I am also presenting openings that I know are very present and aware, and provoking my opponent to have no other choice. To have no other choice but to take them.
Yeah, exactly. Lie to them and make them think that this is okay, and then steal it from them.
You're damn right.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I mean, I think I wish, my hope is that more people will see that and try to adopt that in their fencing, because that to me is just it, it makes it more of a conversation, in terms of the way that the fight progresses, where you do have this guard counter guard approach of, I'm going to give you this look, well, I'm going to change it, I'm going to give you this look, rather than just basically coming at each other like, I'm just going to hold, vom tag, and I'm going to cut in because that's what I know, or things like that. I think there's even room within the KDF tradition, and this isn't just to rag on KDF. This is true for even people who fight in different Italian arts. Sometimes you'll see like Fiore fencers have a tendency to really love that low, point down. It'd be Porta di Ferro Larga in the Bolognese system. I don't know.
Boar's tooth. We know what you talk about. Don't worry.
Yeah. So like, they love to kind of hang out in that guard. So you'll see them hang out in low guards a lot. And so sometimes you get these just kind of common dependencies, because that's where people feel comfortable, rather than, basically learning how to fight from all the different guards, and basically understanding that you can move your opponent with those transitions, because perhaps they feel less comfortable in a certain guard. And so, if you see somebody in a low guard, give them a high guard and threaten their head, and just make them come out of that low guard, because they might not feel comfortable being in a mid guard or even in a high guard themselves.
Yep.
And then you have the initiative. So that's something I would like to see more. That's my wish, my hope. But
it can only get better with time, or at least so we hope.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right. So of the let's get into some of these questions. I can't. We've, um, of the four core authors, who's your favorite and why? Who have you really caught on to so far, and who have you really attached to?
Okay, as with everybody, this is a difficult question.
Yeah,
um, but if I would have to pick in my heart of hearts who I identify with the most, who would I like the most, it's got to be Anonymous. Anonymous is fucking awesome. I love the Anonymous.
yeah,
He's just dirty and mean, and it makes me so happy in my cruel, cool heart. But speaking back to kind of like my first introduction into Bolognese, the person that the author that I really, really like immediately got a good feel for was Manciolino with his single sword stuff, where it's just that falso manco, and then you do everything off of that. I loved that. I love what Manciolino does with his single sword. But now that I am coming back to Bolognese with fresh eyes, like Anonymous just speaks to me very, very clearly. And I'd have to say that he's my favorite.
that's awesome. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but did you look at a lot of the Anonymous left versus right techniques in your lead up to Steel City?
It's funny you mention that because that's exactly what I did.
Right.
I being a left-handed fencer, a lot of times companion weapons can be very difficult for me because they just don't work the same way.
Yep.
So my initial thought process going into that tournament, and then using companion weapons as a whole, was okay. I have this whole section in the Anonymous dedicated to fencing a person with different handedness. So if I can take what he's got there and reverse engineer it for myself, at least in some small part, while keeping it pretty and canonical, that's what I'm going to do. And a lot of like my early thought process, and my choice for going with Anonymous in particular was because I knew he had that section, and that would be a good basis for me to not only understand what his approach is against a person of opposite handedness, but also to inform the general system as a whole while I was working through it.
Yeah, I saw that a lot with the falsos to the hands, and basically trying to set up a lot of those actions with those falsos, those rising falso cuts. And no, it was really cool. I mean, I honestly I love his left versus right stuff too, just because he is really nasty with it. Just like falso to the hand that goes into super brachio and then cut back down on that reverso, and it's
Oh,
such a mean thing to do. It's so nasty. He is definitely when he at the beginning of that text, when he says that you should basically just like any moral is a deficiency in your fencing. I'm just like, man, you read his text and you're just like, yeah, he's mean. He's cruel. Um, but it's sick. It's so sick.
yeah, it is. Um, and then you were so kind enough to do that whole Marazzo sword and buckler lefty versus righty video for me, which thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. um
Yeah.
and that helped me get that second level. For a lot of people, I understand that like interfacing with the books and then taking what you are reading and then translating that into 3D space where you're fencing against a non-compliant opponent is like light years of difficulty. Um, I'm fortunate enough that now that I have a physical language from doing two-handed sword as long as I have, that it's not as difficult for me. But you doing that for me really helped bridge the gap into being able to take what I learned from Anonymous, and what I learned with you when you did that video for Marazzo on Marazzo stuff for me, like just made it so much easier for me to approach approach every fight that I was doing with a framework in mind of how it was going to go down.
Yeah. No, and it looked great. I mean, your fencing was fantastic. I think, you got unlucky with a few exchanges, but I really liked what I saw. I mean, it was your the fact. I mean, gosh, I don't. How long have you been doing sword and buckler leading up to that? Was this a relatively recent thing?
That was my first attempt at serious sword and buckler.
Okay, yeah, and 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 it looked great. That's the thing. That's what I love, and I can tell that you are studying really hard because, the application again, just going in there, working through. I could see when you were going through the anonimo. I could see when you were trying the Marazzo techniques, um, and you know, the fact that you were able to you were as successful as you were, taking that from there, is impressive because in a few years time that's not you're going to be just a huge pain in the ass to fence against. um, but I love that though. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about the Bolognese system is that they don't leave lefties out. We have a lot of lefties in our school, and you know when I teach sword and buckler, I have I can fight left and right handed equally as well.
Mhm.
That's the way that I was trained. So I can do both. So it's usually a lot of times when I'm teaching my left-handed students, I have to teach them personally because like when we're doing like paired drills and stuff like that, because I'm the only other person that can be a lefty.
Yeah.
Um, and I understand how frustrating that can be. And so I'm one of my primary goals for my left-handed students is to equip them with as much ammunition as I possibly can, so that way they can go out into the world and just wreak havoc and just and basically just like get compensation for the fact that they've been left behind as left-handed fencers for so long.
uh, somebody on the international HEMA Discord, shout out to them because they're fucking amazing.
Yeah.
Was like, given a few years time, Connor is going to create an army of left-handed Vadiists that are going to take over the East Coast, and that is truly one of my goals. But for me, approaching the sources as a person that is not really meant to do things the way I do. I found a lot of comfort and a lot of ease in what I do by learning mesospot play mostly. Like like speaking to fencing from that center, playing in that central space. It eliminates a lot of the issues that come with you having an opposite handedness, right? Like guards, opposing guards, opposing cuts, what have you, right? Like all those things can be very, very difficult and complex for a lefty to navigate in our space, since we live in a world of right-handers, and the thing that latched me onto Vadi was the fact that he had answers that were present in his book, and he had guards that worked regardless of the handedness, because if my opponent is in a right-sided guard, I can go into my non-dominant sided guard and I can fence no problem against them. And those same things are present in the Bolognese tradition as well. If my opponent is fencing against me in Coda Lunga Stretta, I can move to Porta de Ferro Stretta. I can move to Porta de Ferro Larga. I can fence from there, no problem. I can even fence from Coda Lunga Stretta, no problem as well. But as long as and it's all predicated on making sure that I get that first constraining action we were talking about, to bring it back full circle, and then playing from there. And not only that, but the additional stuff on top of that, where they teach you what you're supposed to do against an opponent of opposite handedness, makes the Bolognese stuff so awesome as a lefty. It's great.
Yeah. And that's basically like, I mean, going back to those Marazzo plays, that's basically his approach, right? Like, I mean, he has the two void steps, but when you look at everything else that he does, it is all about controlling the center. His attacks, when he's not like, when he is the one that's initiating the attack, he is basically doing something that controls your opponent's sword at the center, presents a threat, and then works around to openings and things along that in that regard. And I think that that speaks to also right-handed fencers when they come up against your army of left-handers that you're creating, to understand that that's actually the best way to fight against a left-handed opponent. Because I know that it's not just the fact that lefties get left out for everything, it's also that most right-handed fencers just don't fight against lefties enough. And this is something they speak to in the text. Like Marazzo says it specifically, like left-handed fencers sometimes have an advantage because they fight right-handed fencers all the time, and right-handed fencers rarely fight a left-handed fencer, and therefore they are at a disadvantage. And that's why he gives that in the
Yep.
text. And so you know, that's an abstract lesson for people who are righties fighting against lefties is, you know, try to basically take the fight to the center and don't try to fight it from wide play, because that's where you get hit. That's where those, you know, those knock rise. And I don't have a good term for that in the Bolognese system. I don't know. I guess, you know, avoiding the
The
step.
concept is there, but like, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, like, you know, striking after they strike. They don't have a good word for it. The Germans are just really good at just coming up with long words that make sense for everybody. So it Nachreisen, the basically like that's just a perfect setup for Nachreisen.
Yep.
So, you know, just, you know, don't put yourself in that situation. So yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Speaking to that as well. You know, I got to bring up my truly favorite technique, mezzo tempo.
Okay. Yep.
And how that works as well. The other thing that is of great advantage to me as a lefty, is the fact that if I know where my opponent's sword is and I know where my sword is, um, being able to recognize those moments where I am weak and strong in the bind to make something like mezzo tempo, and for those that are predominantly Bolognese fencers, I guess you could say a squalembrato or a tondo from like a mezzo spada bind behind the opponent's sword to the face, or if we have any RDL KDF listeners, it would be called a duplieren or something along those lines. Um, those actions work perfectly, and it's one of the other reasons why I've stuck with Vadi for so long, is because he has that concept of do an initiating action to get the Mezzo Spada bind, and then from there cut behind the opponent's sword in the tempo where they're trying to figure out what the fuck you're going to do, and then retreat or advance into stretto play and wrestle them after you get the hit. And being able to work predominantly against an opponent whose strong side is my weak side, whenever I get that cut, for me, which is a reverso, for them is a dritto, I am just able to perfectly untwist my hands and hit them, no problem, every single time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so it's interesting because that's basically Manciolino's first strata play, false edge, right? I mean, you're coming in, you're in this false edge bind, and his first action, you know, he does his best to try to basically describe exactly what you're talking about, which would, I guess, be like a spare cow. I think Greg Millet associated it with a spare cow. I haven't quite figured out if I agree with that or not, but
Ooh.
he's I should default to him because he's got a lot more experience than I have, and every time I've played with a different variation, it hasn't quite worked. So, but I have been thinking about that a lot. But basically, you know, he tells you to do something. He says it's like a stramazzone that goes horizontal and hits them in the side of the head, right? And he says you hit with the false edge, so that would be almost like, you know, kind of coming from here and turning up and going around, right? Basically the same thing. I mean, it's, but I have this sort of prevailing theory that that's basically why the when they teach strata plays, they do it the way that they do, which is unique, where you have true edge to true edge, false edge to false edge, because it's at that point it doesn't matter, right? It
Yep.
doesn't matter how you get to that point. It's just it matters what happens once you're there, right? And that's kind of how the fight progresses.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's really interesting. Um, so so far, what's your favorite what's your favorite weapon system or combination that you've come across?
Okay. This is a hard one. And so my first love, my true love, is it will always be longsword, two-handed sword. But you know,
Yeah.
having this new venture into Bolognese, um, you know, Targa, man, Targa is so awesome. I love sword and Targa. It's so cool. Um, yeah, that would have to
Marazzo.
be. Continue.
Oh yeah. So I mean, Marazzo's got some really nasty techniques with his target plays. He just kind of like takes all of his sword and buckler and just kind of like ramps it up to 11 for Targa. That's where, and I don't know if it's just because you do have that much more provided defense, but he gets really aggressive where he will start pressing into like strata plays and start giving you some really nasty things. Like the one, I think it's the first one where you end up kind of thrusting almost like you're going up in with a punta girita, and or a punta reversa, excuse me. So you're doing a punta reversa and kind of thrusting up, like pushing your target back. So it almost kind of like your hands come together, like you're like holding your hands out, like you're holding a book or something like that. And then as you're transitioning, as your opponent is parrying that, you press into their hands, let your sword come back, and just stab them up under the stomach. And it's
Yeah.
just, oh man, yeah, it's just so good. I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh, what a great play. I just love getting people with that. And you start to get into some of these a lot more complex actions where he's you see a little bit more creativity. His large buckler stuff is pretty good, but the Targa is my favorite too. I love that. It's so good.
Yeah, close second, but I have not played around with this yet. I want to get this made for me. But the Imbracatoria is such a cool
Oh
shield.
God,
I
yeah,
love
I
that
know.
thing. It's
Oh,
so
oh man,
cool. Yeah, seeing Robert Rutherford go through like a bunch of different like solo drills with that, it like
yeah,
just inspired me. I want one of those so bad.
I know. Me too. Me too. And one of my goals for 2020, I didn't finish, and I've gotten distracted since, was to try to finish Marazzo's second book. And so I found I have the plans printed out for the Imbracatur, and I was going to build one, and then I never did. And unfortunately, I guess I will at some point. I'm gonna do it. Maybe when I make one, I'll make one for you. I'll send it out to you. And then next time we get together, we can just have like this nasty Imbracatary battle.
Yeah, the at list of plans that got put on hold for the pandemic. Oh my God, uh, I'm in the process of getting armor squared away right now, which
Ooh.
is my big project. Yeah, uh-huh. Yeah. Oh yeah, you already know my wallet's burning.
It's a good thing you get that awesome shift differential working night shifts at the hospital, sir.
Yeah, yeah. No, it certainly does come in handy when I want to do all of my crazy sword wizardry. Uh,
Well, look, I mean, that's been a big focus for us too, is a lot of people are transitioning to armor. And I mean, a great source for that for the Bolognese is of course the Anonimo.
yep.
So have you
Mhm.
looked at his poleaxe and armor?
In fact, I have. Continuing with this theme of wanting to do all of the things that are Vadi. Vadi's pretty scant on his poleaxe stuff. A lot of it is straight ripped from the Morgan or the Navadi. I can't remember specifically which one, but like there's a lot that's left to be desired in Vadi that. In terms of like his armored stuff, because as he says, I only esteem the sword in two hands. It's all I care about. It's the absolute awesomest, coolest sword there is. So me wanting to get into armor, I basically have those very simplistic plays along with the guards, right? So to expand my knowledge, obviously I was looking at Fiore because Fiore's got all the dope poleaxe shit as well. But Anonimo was directly where I went for when I was like, okay, I want to do armor. I need to have a little bit of a bigger and more complex repertoire if I'm going to be fencing with a poleaxe. And oh, it's fucking nasty. I love it. I think it was Stephen Freitas who was like, stab him in the dick.
Yes, just stab in the dick. That's it. Yep.
The other person I've been looking to as well is Pedro Monte.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, because Monty's got a lot of really cool stuff for poleaxe as well, and his Levada with the poleaxe just also really speaks to me because it's so straightforward and it combos into each other just so beautifully.
Yeah. I actually need to get Mike Pendergast on the podcast and talk to him about Monty, because he's got like, I took his Monty class
Mhm.
when I was at Lord Baltimore's Challenge back in, I guess it was 2018, maybe 19. I can't remember. It was, the before times.
A
But
long ago, yes.
yes. But his class was like super interesting because he basically took, like one of the things that he had explained, and I would love to, this is what I want to talk to him about, is just um, taking the sword and one hand plays, and he was talking about how this basically translates into it's basically Monty's system. Like, he teaches the same thing with most of the weapons, and once you really understand his concept for one weapon, you'll understand all of them. And yeah, those like cuts from below are just so nasty, and then just
Yeah.
like turning that point over. And the way that he taught it was super fascinating. So
I'm going to make a quick little announcement that will be an assistance for you in the future. But coming out in early October, mid-October, myself and Ian Davis have finished writing a book that
cool.
is all on Vadi. It's going to be called Wielding the Light of Mars. And it is my commentary and Ian's translation of the book with full color images, along with plates describing all the actions that are present in Vadi, along with a video series dedicated to for people that buy the book to see all the actions, me going through all of them. And
Yeah.
part of that is detailing Monty's Levada of the two-handed sword, because in the 15th chapter of Vadi, he makes reference to a fencer who uses 2 rising blows on both sides,
Yeah.
which is, in my opinion, very clearly throwing some shade at a certain man who was working in the court of Urbino, a gig that he wanted to land. So Ian is big into Monty as well, and so one of the last IGXs I was at, we got the chance to fence with an appropriately sized sword for him and an appropriate sized sword for me, doing Monty versus Vadi, and the description of what Vadi tells you to do against a person who uses those 2 rising blows seamlessly transitioned into exactly what the text says. So whether that be in reference to a guy who was called by Castiglione the fucking the most ballerist man in all the most ballerist man at arms in all of Italy, is obviously up in the air, because we don't have any like strict evidence outside of this theory and the book that we got. But because of that relation, I have focused on, and because of the book, I focused on learning more about the Levada, and we actually do have a section at the back dedicated specifically to teaching somebody who wants to learn it, and a translation of the Levada of the sword in 2 hands.
That sounds freaking amazing. Like, I'm so excited for that to come out. I will absolutely buy a copy. You did. Yeah. Wow. That's I can't wait. That's super exciting. That, like, I'm like, I can't even express how excited I am to get my hands on that and get through it, because like I said, that's my goal right now, is I'm going back and doing Fiore and Vadi, and I mean, that's going to be a fantastic resource. First of all, the fact that you guys found that connection and have been working through that connection, to me, just excites my nerd so much. Like, I like, it just makes me so happy. So that's and I'm happy for you too, because that's a great accomplishment, and that's got to feel really good, and you deserve it, because you've been the Vadi master, going around spreading the good word of Vadi to every corner of the world. So
Yeah, man, it's gonna be tight.
yeah.
But yeah, no, those rising blows are so nasty. Oh my god, like especially because like rising blows like that are just so uncommon in like modern longsword fencing today. And obviously Monty calls for a sword that's like bigger, like like height of your eyebrows, your nose area in terms of its length. But they worked just fine with the longsword, and having more folks spend time with those sources, I think will make for a more diverse degree of fencing across whoever decides to buy it.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth with my interpretation of the second chapter of Marazzo's two-handed sword, where he
Mhm.
starts with those 2 rising blows, and if he is trying to emulate Monty, and with that action where he throws those 2 rising cuts, I know a lot of people have kind of it seems like the
Oh, oh, he froze. Oh no. Oh no.
in mind of how Monty does that, I can see that there could potentially be a tactical advantage to doing something like that.
Well, if you think about it, right, when you're doing those two blows, and a question: does Marazzo specify whether they're true edge or false edge rising?
I think he says you throw rising falsos, one from the right and one from the left.
Okay, so this is something I came to understand from doing it, but those two rising falsos that you do when you're entering into measure are so great at number one covering and protecting your hands. Like you have so much blade in front of you that that like you don't have to worry about getting tagged really at all when you're coming up and you're going into the second one. And they cover so much distance when you're closing in with both of them that they just give you so many beautiful setups to work Mezzospada or even stay working in Largo if you just hit them on the first or the second, that you can really combo into whatever else you want to do after you get them done. There's a reason Monty does them, and it works beautifully.
Yeah, and to just kind of help enlighten a few people who don't understand what the levata is, basically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you start with the true edge and you turn your hands over to the false edge, right? As you're
Yep.
doing the cut. So you do the same thing on both sides, and it's that turn of the wrist where you're snapping the false edge over. And that's basically what you were describing in terms of that coverage, because you do get that turnover, which kind of helps to protect the hands.
Yep, absolutely. That is exactly on point.
Yeah. Yeah, we need more Monty practitioners. That'd be fantastic. And man, HEMA's so cool, isn't it? Like
Yeah, no, it's
just
fucking
like
awesome.
every time I think that I've got like some sort of a settled idea, I always end up finding a rabbit hole that or a rabbit trail that I end up following, and then finding something that's even more cool. Or somebody tells me something that's super cool, like you tell me that you're doing this project, and then I'm just like, all right, I'm gonna head down that way too. This is fantastic. I've got so much stuff to do. I just don't have enough time to do it.
Yeah, if only we could just do sword fighting and nothing else.
I know. I try to make it so that way. That's kind of like my goal. Like I actually just went back to work at the hospital just recently, so I had more time during the week, and now, I only work 3 days a week. I only work weekends, but I work, my 40 hours in those 3 days a week, but it gives me 4 days off a week. And
Yep.
I'm like, that's worth it to me, you know,
I,
more time
I
to do all the stuff I want to do.
I'm on the same schedule. I work 312s. Yep.
It's
Hmm.
awesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
We live the good life, sir. We live the good life. Um, so I mean, we've kind of what I know. I mean, you've definitely refined your Vadi interpretations really well in terms of not only being able to take them practically into tournaments, but also to really condense them in ways where you're teaching people practically how to do these things and fantastic workshops. I've taken your Hipster Longsword workshop a few times, and it's a great class. I mean, if anybody has an opportunity to take that class with Connor, you are missing out. If you don't, whatever else you're doing is not as important. I guarantee you. But that said, a lot of people see the finished product and they don't see the challenges that really kind of build into that finished product. So what are some of the challenges that you faced in developing your interpretations, and how have you overcome them?
Well, that is a beautiful question. And you know, the thing about HEMA, and in my opinion, the beauty of it is that we are all working towards this goal that we will inevitably never really fully know if it's correct or not, right? And we are just trying our best to collaborate and share, and like use this crucible of tournaments and conversation and research to break apart the things that are unnecessary or are in some cases flat out wrong, and keep that which is central to our primary thrust in all that we do. And I struck a lot of dead ends getting through all this stuff, and in my opinion, my relationship with failure has changed greatly because of the fact that I've undertaken HEMA, and because I've tried to like mold this like book towards what I believe it to be its canonical conclusion, at least in some way, and that never ends, and it never will. And I find some beauty in that permanence of that. It is always a goal that is being fine-tuned and tweaked and changed as more information comes to light, or parts of it die off and are clipped, like you're manicuring a plant or a rose bush, whatever, what have you, right? And part of that was me being okay um, with failure, right? With me going out there and competing in tournaments using techniques that I had just really like gotten like a working interpretation of in my own brain, practicing it in free fencing, and then taking it to a tournament and being okay with losing with those interpretations. A perfect example of that is when I was working on what I like to call the proto impuntanto in Vadi. He has this action where he says, and if you want to make him feel the point, let fly a reverso, turning it crosswise with the false edge to the throat, right? And for me, I didn't really know what a falso impuntanto was, so I did not have that kind of like latch on point until very recently to be like, oh, these things are very similar. So I went through a variety of different ideas on how that works. I went through like an idea that it's like this single tempo or like counter time action where like you cross your wrists and you throw it at your opponent like as they're doing a strike against you, and you stick the point Shielhow-ish, you could say. And that ended up not being able to land a point at all. It set me up great for a counter action after it was parried, right? Because my wrists were crossed, I was able to do a rotare, like a stramazzone, to the opposite side to cut to the hands or the head or whatever the case may be. But I was never able to accomplish at all sticking the point the way I was until the past like 2 years, when I discovered this turning of the sword after you get the reverso into breve lunghezza, which I guess you could call guardia d'entrar if we're comparing it to the Bolognese sources. It's very similar. Yep, just like that. And that caught me a lot of lumps when I was working with it. Like I remember distinctly, I was fencing against Chris Smoot in Capital Clash, and I threw this cut at him, and he threw a Shielhow at me. And because of the mechanics of how your hands are in that particular position, it's a very weak position against an overbind. And so when I threw it, my front hand popped off of my sword, and then he came, and then I tried to cover myself with my sword just on with my hand just on my pommel by bringing my sword up, and he came back up, and my sword went flying into the fucking air, and I went like threw my hands up, and he thought I was trying to grapple him, so he just conked me straight on the head. Working with the guards is another example. In Vadi, like your two predominant high guards are posta vera finestra and posta frontale, which are basically like your ox finestra-ish, hands high, point forward, but instead it like being like point high. And I couldn't for the fucking life of me figure out how to throw a fendente for that for years. For years, I was just like, how am I supposed to do this? And it took me just like hours of cutting, just doing like cutting in free fencing, cutting at home, trying to fence in those positions strictly in tournaments, just hours and hours of trying to make those things work, until I finally figured out how to get it done. And part of that process it changes your relationship with failure. The other thing is too is like having hypothesis and ideas about who the masters were in the first place. You know, we don't know jack shit about who Vadi is. We got like 4 different guys who he could be. Really 2 now, maybe 3, but like, you know, struggling looking at court documents or like trying to find records and archives in Italy and like researching forum posts from however long, you know, these all of these things make for this simulacrum that we now have that we bring to each other when we decide to fence. And you know, that process takes love for what you're doing and being okay with it being wrong and then moving past it. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing to add to that because it was perfect. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just relate a similar anecdote in that this is actually one of the things that I love about HEMA, in terms of, and I think this goes for any martial art, but true for HEMA in my journey, as because it is the only martial art that I have, similar to you, right? Is that going through that same process of learning to live with failure and learning to live with, you know, basically kind of recreating myself through failure and testing myself to points where I do fail with the intention of making myself better has actually translated into other areas of my life and made me a better person in that regard. And like, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this journey and this path that we're on, is that like it really does help you to shape out the things that your deficiencies in so many different areas. And I mean, it's absolutely fantastic because it, you know, it serves my nerd. It serves
Yep.
my wanting to, you know, just do something physical and get out there and you know, test myself not only from a mental standpoint but my body as well. And then it makes me a better person, and it's just full of the best people. It really is. Like, the
For
diversity of
damn sure.
HEMA is one of the coolest things that I've ever experienced in my entire life. This is one of the best communities, um, and it's cool. It's really cool.
Yeah. The other thing is too is becoming a teacher on top of that. Like, you know, when I first got into this, I wanted to learn swords. I never thought that I would be here talking with you about this right now. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, if I would have been, you know, discussing all of these complex and arcane things on a podcast and like researching all the stuff as deeply as they had, but not even just researching it but teaching it to other people, I don't think I would have an answer for you, you know. And not even just teaching it but molding a curriculum and figuring out how to impart these complex and dense topics and unpack them to other people so that they can understand it, interface with it, and not just that, but take them and do them the way that you do them too, is just such a journey, such a beautiful thing. And making that available and free for everybody who decides to show up at your door has been something that has been transforming for myself as well. You know, we underwent a pretty big shift in terms of curriculum at PCFG post pandemic. You know, where we not even just like reformatted the structure of our class, but switched to focus entirely. You know, where now we're doing like 2 months of longsword, 2 months of side sword, but also instead of us teaching Fiore as like an intro to longsword, we are going straight into Vadi off the bat, you know, and learning how to convey those concepts and get people comfortable with getting hit, with hitting other people through the medium of using sparring games and like foam swords has been awesome, because now my students 2-3 months in are doing canonical actions that like just make my heart sing.
Yeah.
And a lot of that takes just like straight up trial and error and listening to other people who have been uh, maybe not even just doing this for longer than you have, listening to the wisdom of people who have been teachers for a long time is part of that, but getting other perspectives and being okay with taking those perspectives and molding them into what you do as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, um, what is something that you think that we as a community can improve upon to better reflect the sources in our fencing, especially since you are such a historically, dependent fencer? What's something you want to see the general community improve
um well, hmm, tough question. I think that, like, generally speaking, the biggest thing that can be done is getting in touch with those instructors. Forming networks in your local area, whether if you have clubs nearby, and just cross referencing with other people, asking what their opinions are on specific things, and trying to um, come to grips with understanding these techniques and these tactical frameworks that we're trying to pull from the ether and pull from the sources. um, you're not alone. You're not. You got so many folks that'd be more than willing to reach out and help you. And I know that's a very anxiety driving thing, but you got folks out there that are willing to help you. The other thing that we can do as well, um, is, I think the biggest thing is being okay with losing and then reformatting what your ideas are afterwards. Even if I go out there and I end up 20th, last place, whatever the case may be, I know I'm fencing the way that my book tells me to. And um you know at the end of the day, the medals and the shiny things at tournaments are fucking sick, and I'm glad that people can get them, and I'm so thankful to event organizers for doing all the Herculean work that they do to make sure that things run as smoothly as they do. But being true to what you do, um, whatever the case may be, whether that's Fiore, Vadi, Marazzo, RDL, Meyer, and going out there and looking like you're doing the thing. We need more of that.
on?
Easier said than done.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. And, I mean, I can't agree more than just, I mean, in terms of it does take it takes courage, to step in. And I mean, I think that people still try to do like historically relevant techniques in their fencing, but like you said, just, taking it to that step of just like, make it look like you're really trying to fence in a historical way. um I love that because I understand people's idea of like, well, is that necessary to approach the fight in that way and then progress? And my answer is yes, absolutely. I understand people's reasoning that they can still do the actions that they want to do from, approaching it in a different way. But I mean, one, it just looks amazing, right? Like, I mean, it looks incredible. And if that's what we're trying to recreate, then why not make it look as close to that as possible? I mean, you're not in some way doing something that's um, ahistorical. You're doing something that's hyper historical, and it might not look as modern or cool to a modern person. They might think that it looks a little egregious in some way. But like you said, like, and I know that we're recording this before the episode with Devin Borman comes out, but I will give you a spoiler here. And then, everybody else who listens to this one will have hopefully already listened to that one and they'll know what I'm talking about. So, one of the things that he was talking about is like, we have to understand the context of what it means to be an Italian gentleman when we're looking at these texts, right? And so much of that is basically posturing. Um, and talking to Kurt, bringing him back up, he's done a lot of research in terms of the psychology of fighting and things like that. And he constantly references one book called. um, what is it? The Art of Killing, I think, or something like that. It's
Yeah, I know which
ridiculous.
one you're talking about. I know it. Yeah, like On Killing or something like that.
On Killing, yeah. Okay, so and it was written by a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, and basically the one of the things that he talks about in the book is that the the United States military did a study during World War II because there was this after I think it was after the Normandy invasion, they were basically lining up the number of bullets that were fired with the number of casualties that were sustained, and basically what they found is the accuracy totals for men in combat didn't match up with the accuracy totals from basic training, right? And so they were like, what's the disconnect here? Because it went from something like 40% down to like 3%, which is ridiculous, right? And so they were like, all right, so what's the disconnect? Why are we using so much ammunition? What they ended up finding from interviewing soldiers who were involved in the battle is that a lot of times the natural inclination for people who are involved in a combat situation is to posture. So they'll shoot over somebody's head to make them keep their head down so they don't actually have to kill them, because most people don't have the capacity to kill somebody, right? It's only like 2% of the population that can actually kill somebody, like without any sort of like major psychological trauma. Um, and so because we're not psychopaths, humans naturally, because it is a defiance of the human nature to be able to, you know, unempathically kill somebody. What we will tend to do is to posture, right? And you take that into a hyper like cultural context where your manliness needs to be on display. And forgive me for leaving out the ladies here, but your ladiness can be on display as well. And everyone's um, prowess can be on display, I should say. So you're displaying your prowess. Let me say it that way. You're displaying your prowess, and you're coming into this engagement, and you are posturing. You're showing that you're showing your skill. You're showing your technical proficiency, and you're communicating to your opponent that this isn't going to be easy. And that means a lot. And if we can take that into a modern context, it still has the same effect. Like you watch somebody like start to move in that way and just like really kind of like move their body, and you see like how smooth they are in their transitions between different guards and like how threatening they look, and you just think to yourself, this is going to be a tough fight, right? I mean, who doesn't
Yeah.
think that?
Well, looking at secondary and like tertiary sources is so important to us, like to understanding that concept. I've been loving being subscribed to Michael Chittister's Patreon, where
Oh
he's been
yeah,
going through Pozo.
yeah,
It's so sick. I love reading about all of these weird dueling clauses. Um, you know, and another thing that you touched on there is like um, gender constructs in the sources, right? Which like it's important to understand that shit because it informs the entirety of the entirety of the art. And we're thankfully now in a place where it doesn't matter as much what you got going on if you're coming out there and you're showing your skill, you're showing your technical ability. um, that's what people see.
yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing because swords are for fucking everybody.
That's right.
It doesn't matter who you are. Swords are for everybody, and HEMA is for everybody. And like you were saying before, we got a wonderful community that protects and uplifts people of color and the LGBTQ plus community. And you see beautiful fencing from people of all stripes, all backgrounds, and it's fucking sick. It's awesome that we've it's obviously a thing that will be ongoing, and it's a difficult road to pass. But you know I've seen fencers that are non-binary do beautiful, amazing, and incredible work. Like Izzy, I can't remember. Izzy Baden Payne
Baden Payne,
is,
yeah.
yeah, is a
Oh my
fucking
God.
beautiful fencer. I love watching them fight. They move with elegance and grace with everything they do. Um, Tanya Smith does a mean sword and buckler, and like all of these people exemplify their arts. And the other thing is that they understand the context of it all. Um, so it's I love HEMA.
I do too. I do too. I fought Izzy Baden Payne at Lord Baltimore's challenge, and when I fought them in the first exchange, we fought in pools, and I ended up getting a really good um, technique on them, where I was able to basically parry with a false edge, wind up over, and come through. I mean, basic
Yeah.
Bolognese, just false edge,
Yeah.
wind right, and come in and got him. And and then I fought them in the elimination rounds, and I started to get that same technique, and they basically just drove my point down, and then started to wind around, came around and got a grapple on me, and just completely destroyed me in the exchange.
I can't hear you. Oh. Oh.
Side sword event where, I mean, we were probably at like our 8th or 9th intention in a continuous fight, like not like breaking apart and then coming back together. Like we were just exchanging cuts and winds and thrusts and things like that in the continuation of this process without really kind of leaving each other's presence. And they ended up just pulling off this fantastic technique at the end and got me. And it was a first blood tournament. I wish I could have had more exchanges with them, but it didn't unfortunately fall that way. But it was incredible. It was just absolutely incredible. So you're absolutely right. And yeah, HEMA's awesome.
Uh, I'm trying to think of how to follow that up. um,
Sorry.
you're all
And
good. You're all good, man.
aside, it's just I love talking about like great fights, especially when it comes to like side sword fights. You know, it's like I don't get to fight a lot of people with side sword, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a damn shame that it's not a bigger thing on the East Coast. But that brings me back to talking about modern HEMA fencing.
Okay.
The other thing that I think is important to remember is that it is okay if you start off not looking like the books. Like,
It's true.
yeah,
Yes.
if you go back and you look at my first tournament, Long Point 2017 in the rookie pools, uh, I was stuck on doing this weird boar's tooth posture where I looked like an old man with a rake. Uh, and that's talking from a low skill level, but from a high skill level too, where folks have figured out what works for them and they go out there and they do it. And it's this collection of various different sources that they've combined together into this working framework that works for them in modern tournament too. That's fine. That's okay. You're doing your thing and going out there and showing what you got. Even if it doesn't look like your Arto Famo or Adam Franti, when you're fencing, ain't wrong either. Um, you know, and like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty much it.
No, that's a really great point, and I agree. Yeah. So let me clarify my previous statement, because I understand where you're coming from with this, and that it might discourage people. And you're right in that you've got to start somewhere, right?
Yep.
Like, and it's okay, um, because I think you also did Raleigh Open in 2017, didn't you?
Yeah, and I looked like shit.
See, that's what you think, right? Like, I mean, you didn't do great in the tournament, but I remember watching you because that was the first HEMA tournament I ever attended. And
Ooh, okay.
I didn't actually fight in the tournament, but I volunteered because that was a TSG event. And so I just did scorekeeping. But I remember seeing you warming up, and I was like, wow, those guys look like that's really interesting what they're doing. Like, I mean, the way that you guys were moving was intentionally trying to make it look more historical, and it was different than a lot of everything else that I was seeing that was there. There were a lot of different approaches to how to approach the fight there. Um, I remember thinking though that at the time that I thought that I was not aware of Vadi. I don't know if you were doing Vadi at that point,
I was not.
or maybe you were doing Fiore, but
I was.
I think remember watching like the continuation of movement. I was like, huh, they must be doing Meyer, which is I don't know why that was in my head, but I had it in my head that you were a Meyerist until I found out that you were doing Vadi, and then I learned more about Vadi, and then I was just like, oh, I see. But sometimes the perception of self-perception is not always the same as the perception of other people around you, and just making a concerted effort to, even if you have to do it constrained within a box of your understanding, still making the effort sometimes will leave an impression on other people, the way that you left an impression on me.
Very true. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, up in Philly, do you guys have any events that you guys end up holding or hosting or anything like that? I know that the pandemic is still, quite the hot topic at the time, but
Yeah, well, I don't know if we're going to be running anything in the near future. We had Revolution Rumble, which was going to be our first breakout onto the tournament scene, but that has gone in the wash along with everybody else's plans. But for now, we do not have any events. But COVID pending, I am going to be traveling around and hopefully taking the Vadi Roadshow with me.
sweet.
Yeah, I'm going to be teaching a class on mesotempo and the tactical view of the fight from Vadi's perspective up at IGX Iron Gate Exhibition in October. I'm going to be missing y'all for Oktoberfest, which I'm very sad about. I'm very, very sad about. Trying to get those switches for weekends is a tough thing, but I will be coming down there at some point. I gotta now.
Yeah. Well, I can go ahead. I got a confirmation from Greg Milley that he's going to be down here next year for Oktoberfest. So
Nice.
maybe that's the year to do it.
Maybe that will be.
But yeah, I mean, so is that in the future plans though? Are you guys going to start hosting events and things like that other than
eventually we hope so, yes. But up now, right now, everything is up to the nebulous future.
So outside of in-person events, the Vadi Roadshow, are you gonna be doing anything that's digital that people can access and kind of attain if they, can't travel?
Well, I got the Hipster Longsword series on the Sinestro channel that folks can check out if they're interested in learning some more about Vadi. Got Wheeled in the Light of Mars that's going to be coming out beginning of October, mid-October, somewhere around there. And along with that will be a video series that's in the book for folks to check out if they need that additional little smidge to help them get through.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Now, if people want to support Hipster Longsword, is there any way that they can give you any sort of financial backing, or is it just something that you do pro bono and for free and for the better of the community?
That is something that funny you say that. I was spurred on by folks being putting themselves out on a limb and putting their interpretations out on YouTube and other things. And so Hipster Longsword is my way of giving back to the folks that were kind enough to do that. So if you like and subscribe to me, that'd be great.
I'll actually put a link in the show notes so people can find it, because it is amazing. It's an incredible channel. And it's hilarious in your own way. is, just something that I absolutely love. It's like Steve Zissou doing Longsword.
That's like my favorite Wes Anderson movie too.
Yeah, it's incredible. So it's good stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, my friend.
Awesome. Awesome. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else that you want to discuss?
Listen to more L'Arte dell'Arme. JD's podcast is fucking awesome. Please go into the back catalog. Please listen to it. It has helped me inform my Bolognese fencing so much. You've done an incredible job of collecting this wide assortment of experts and instructors, and it's been my guiding light through this new journey that I've been on. Please go check out Chicago Swordplay Guild's channel for their Spada Sola stuff. It's all fantastic, wonderful. Please check out Martin's Schildwache Potsdam stuff too. Martin's done an incredible job of conveying a lot of this stuff in DL Gautier. Yeah, see y'all in the future.
That's right. All right. Well, Connor, thanks again for coming on, and it was a pleasure, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, my friend.
And that concludes another episode of L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. That was such a fun conversation with Connor. Both fun and enlightening at the same time. And I think that perfectly encompasses Connor's personality and documents it for the future, which I think is just absolutely perfect because, that's really who he is as a person. And can't thank him enough for coming on and doing this with me because that was a lot of fun. Next week's guest is going to be Bill Grandy. Bill is not traditionally a Bolognese fencer, but he does dabble in the Bolognese systems and likes to look at Manciolino. The cool thing about Bill is he is a incredibly experienced fencing instructor, and not just with historical martial arts, but also Olympic fencing. So I'm really excited to get his perspective on the overall connections that we can draw between historical and modern fencing, and then also just his impressions of Manciolino and the things that he's done, because he's created some really great content when he has decided to take a look at the Bolognese system and dabble and play with it. So really looking forward to that conversation. So, as always, stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.